Welcome back to the Sean S. Show. Today we'll be discussing the Biden administration's first major foreign policy initiatives, with Vice President Harris in Guatemala and Mexico this week to discuss the migration crisis, and President Biden, who will be traveling to the UK this weekend to attend his first G7 summit as president. And he'll also be meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin this month to discuss all kinds of issues. We're going to be taking a look at those stories and how they affect us here back at home. Today, June 8th, 2021. From Anchor by Spotify, this is the Ishan S. Show. With me, your host, Ishan. And welcome back to the Ishan S. Show. It's great to have you back on, and it's great to be back hosting again for today's episode. Let's get right into it. So, as you may have heard in the opening, today we're going to be talking about the Biden administration's first few major foreign policy initiatives. Now, I say first few because many officials within the administration are going on their first foreign trips and dealing with their dealing with the first few major foreign policy events and initiatives in the presidential term thus far. Of course, Secretary of Defense and Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Anthony Blinken have been working on this since their first days in office, but the president and the vice president and other officials are now also beginning to get involved in this. They weren't as involved these past few months, I would probably say, because of the issues that we were facing here back at home. Domestic issues that we were facing here at home, the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccine distribution, economic crises, etc., all kinds of issues our country was facing here at home. So I don't think President Biden and VP Harris really had the time to go in depth on these matters and really address these as quickly as they probably would normally in a normal presidential term, without all these kinds of issues facing them. Not to say that the issues have been dealt with completely, but I think the administration feels that they've done enough to try to lower the need of focus on these matters. But despite that, I think the Biden administration still has had a few of its foreign policy challenges. Early on, the military coup in Myanmar and the issues with Russia through the cyber attacks and hacking that we discussed in our first episode, tensions with China, and more recently, I think we all can recall the Israeli and Palestinian fighting that had happened for, I think, 10 or 11 days. That was on the Biden administration's radar for a while. So it's not that the Biden administration hasn't had their foreign policy challenges. It's just that now they're getting more and more involved. A quick overview of the week. Vice President Harris was in Mexico today to talk with their president, and she was in Guatemala yesterday on a 2-day trip to Mexico and Central America to talk about the root causes of migration issues from the region. President Biden will be traveling to the UK later this week to meet with their Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and then also to meet with leaders of the G7, which are Canada, France, the UK, of course, Germany, Japan, and Italy. He'll be meeting with them later this weekend, and later this month, the president will also be meeting with the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, in a very highly anticipated summit in Geneva. So there's a lot going on with the Biden administration's foreign policy, and it's a pretty big week. We'll start off with Vice President Harris's trip to Central America and Mexico this week. In these past few days to talk about the root causes of illegal migration. So, quick reminder, Harris was tapped by President Biden in March to work on finding the, quote, root causes of migration following a surge in illegal migration from the Northern Triangle countries to the United States, specifically our southern border. And many of these migrants are undocumented, and many of them are actually unaccompanied migrant children who are coming to the U.S. border that are being smuggled across, that are being sent across. It's a big crisis down there. So Harris was tasked by the president to look at this issue and try to understand why it is that this is happening in the first place. So Harris had, for these past few months, been in discussions, diplomatic talks with the leaders of these countries, trying to figure out what's going on, and not really doing a lot of public work, but doing stuff behind the scenes to try to do this. But this trip to these countries are her first foreign trip as vice president, on her first foreign trip after getting inaugurated, where she met with the president of Guatemala and the president of Mexico. We'll look at her Guatemala trip first. She landed there Sunday night and met with their president, Alejandro Giammattei, yesterday, where they talked about all kinds of things, and VP Harris announced with their president that a number of steps are going to be taken to help address the root causes of illegal migration from the region. In a press conference, she announced that the U.S. wanted to help try to find ways to decrease the amount of migration coming directly from these countries, and specifically locations, regions, or cities where in these countries where it's a big issue. In the press conference, she talked about how issues like corruption, crime, and lack of economic opportunity are all reasons for many people here to migrate across the U.S. border, and go through Mexico and then get here to the United States. It's a very long journey for many of these migrants, and it's a very difficult one too. So they want to try to find ways to really stop it. If you look at many news interviews, I was watching many of them, so the reporters there in Guatemala who are with the vice president got to interview Guatemalan citizens and residents, where they were discussing why it is that people are actually making the move. If you want to check them out, you can go check them out, and you can see for the various reasons that are being provided for all kinds of travel. But for the vice president, these were the main issues that she wanted to deal with. Specifically, that she would want to really deal with the issue of corruption in the region. So, in an announcement at a press conference, Vice President Harris said that the Departments of State, Treasury, and Justice would help train law enforcement in the country of Guatemala and support Guatemalan prosecutors in the region in anti-corruption efforts to try to deter away that anti-corruption, which may very well be a big issue in the migration crisis that people are finding reason to migrate all the way to the United States for. Of course, in the press conference, many reporters were pressing Harris on why she hadn't visited other Northern Triangle countries like El Salvador and Honduras. Didn't provide a big, substantial reason. Many news outlets and many sources are saying that Harris's main reason is probably that there's corruption issues within these countries themselves. So talking with them is not necessarily the most useful. But that she wants to work with them to try to create more opportunity within the countries to stop the migration from them. President Giammattei was on the front end on one of these questions, but he was pushing back against reporters that were asking these questions, not clearly answering many of the questions about corruption issues, his administration's corruption issues. But Harris made clear that the U.S. government would want to address corruption within Northern Triangle countries. Now, another thing that she said was that she wanted to make clear that the U.S. government would, quote, discourage illegal migration. But then the comments that she made after that were, she said, do not come, and then repeated, do not come, in a message to potential migrants in Guatemala who were thinking of perhaps coming. She said, do not come, do not come. Take a listen.
And I want to emphasize that the goal of our work is to help Guatemalans find hope at home. At the same time, I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come. The United States will continue to enforce our laws and secure our border. There are legal methods by which migration can and should occur.
The vice president faced a little criticism from the left back here for those comments. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, said that she was, quote, disappointed in this, and said that the United States should have, or Vice President Harris should have maybe not made that comment. But I don't know. It's not for me to dabble into, but I'd say that the comment has produced some sort of newsworthy or controversy of some sort, because that is the main headline for her Guatemala trip so far. Do not come, do not come. But it's a clear message that she wants to send to Guatemalans and any other migrants from the region that may be thinking of making the journey across the U.S. border. Harris said that she was talking with American CEOs. This is a meeting that she's been having for a while ago, but she said she was in discussions with American CEOs and American companies to try to find ways to create economic opportunity for that region by bringing in jobs or some sort of factory or whatever that big companies could do for the region. Harris cited a lack of economic opportunity as one of the root causes that she found were a reason for people to migrate. So the talks with this have been going on for that. In addition to her trip to Guatemala today, Tuesday, Harris was also in Mexico, where she met with President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. The two agreed to expand agreed to expand high-level collaboration on bilateral economic and security issues, and affirmed a new partnership to work jointly in Central America to address the root causes of migration. This is what they said in a meeting, or this is a statement that was made in a meeting with in a bilateral meeting with President Obrador. Harris also said that she'll be meeting with women entrepreneurs and labor leaders in the country, two groups that don't get necessarily paid attention enough by the sitting presidential administration in Mexico. So Harris said that she'll be meeting with them and also work with the president of Mexico to try to limit migration from the Northern Triangle and Central American countries. Mexico also has its own migration issues. Many people here in the United States are not completely aware of that, but many Northern Triangle and Central American countries also have people that are migrating to Mexico, and Mexico is also trying to deal with the issue themselves. So when Harris said that the discussions were mutual interests, I think she was completely right when she said so. The interests and the topics that were being discussed were topics that were in the interest of both countries, between both leaders, that I think they wanted to address. So that was not a lot. I don't know that much about what happened in the Mexico discussion because she currently is in Mexico right now. And she had met with, I wasn't completely aware of what was being discussed in the meeting thus far because I believe I started recording right when the meeting was occurring. So I'm getting updates that I'm announcing to you as I read it here. But so the talks with the presidents of Guatemala and Mexico between Harris seemed to be productive. I think they did discuss some issues that people do care about, and in both countries, and when they were meeting with one another, the topics being discussed seemed to be productive, and they did come to some real conclusion. Not some real conclusions, but they did come to some information about the crises that both countries were facing whenever they were meeting, and that they would try to work on the root causes of migration. Now, ever since being tapped to address the root causes of migration issue by Biden, Harris has faced a lot of criticism for not visiting the U.S. southern border, which isn't exactly what she was asked to do anyway, but she's faced a lot of criticism from many Republicans for not going down to the southern border and taking a look at what's been going on. She's been reminded repeatedly that she's not been going down to the border to check out what's going on with the migration crisis there. Now, here's a quick look at the border crossings in April. So in April, U.S. Customs and Border Protection encountered about 178,000 migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border in April. So of which 79,000, which is about 44%, were from the Northern Triangle countries. This is numbers provided by CNN. And these are the very countries that Harris is trying to address the migration crisis from. And I think that's where she's facing a lot of criticism, that these are the countries where the migration is coming from, but you're not actually going to the border to deal with it. I don't think, personally, that Harris was asked to go to the border or was asked to do anything about the border. I think she was just asked to look at what was causing people to come to the border. And she, I guess, maybe facing that criticism that she's not going to the border, not looking at the issues, and she's facing a lot of Republican outlash for not doing so. In the same report, about 17,000 kids, unaccompanied kids, had come across the border. That was down from the 19,000 in March. But regardless, it's still a pretty high number. So whatever the Biden administration is doing, I think probably they should be doing it soon so that they can try to get this crisis under control, so that we can lower the amount of migration happening over the country, over the border, the amount of unaccompanied children, at least, coming across the border, and illegal migration happening. That's what should be addressed. And I think the productive talks might be an indicator of some sort of resolution or work that may be coming out of it. I'm not sure if that may be good or bad, but something might come out of these talks. Now, in response to the criticism that Harris has faced for not visiting the U.S. southern border, she said that in an unscheduled statement to the press pool, she said that she said, quote, in response to the border discussion, she said, quote, "Listen, I've been to the border before. I will go again." Harris, according to CNN, Harris appeared frustrated by the repeated questioning of her absence from the border. She said, quote, she continued to say, quote, "When I'm in Guatemala dealing with root causes, I think we should have a conversation about what's going on in Guatemala," she added. In an interview with NBC News, Harris was again asked by Lester Holt about why she wasn't going to the border, and she responded, quote, I haven't been to Europe, and I don't understand the point you're making," she said. Harris has faced a lot of questions for not visiting the border. And again, I'll say that I don't think she was specifically asked to go to the border or do things like that. But now at this point, I think with all the backlash she's facing, I wouldn't be surprised if the Biden administration sent her or the president down there just to take a look at what's happening and, try to vie away from that criticism that the administration is facing for this. It ties in these talks that are happening because the talks that we're seeing right now are a big part of Biden's foreign policy focus, not so much elsewhere. This has been a huge discussion and throughout the presidency so far, with the migration crisis that's going on. We'll talk about Biden's trip to the UK and his meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin after a short break. And we're back from the break. Like I said before we left, we're going to be talking about President Biden's first foreign trip as President of the United States. This week, he'll be traveling to 3 different countries, the UK, Belgium, and Switzerland, where he'll be meeting with world leaders to talk about all kinds of things. I like to think that this trip is in 2 separate parts, the UK part, the G7 part, and the NATO and Russia part. Like I said, he'll be meeting with G7 leaders, and then later on he'll be meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Reuters has provided a nice itinerary of the Biden trip, which outlines the 8-day-long event where on June 9th, Biden and the First Lady will depart on Wednesday morning. On June 10th, Biden will meet Prime Minister Johnson at the site of the G7 summit. On June 11th, 12th, and 13th, Biden will attend the G7 summit, and we'll talk about U.S. policy priorities, and we'll also meet with G7 leaders. On June 13th, Biden will also be meeting with Queen Elizabeth at Windsor Castle. And later that night, Biden will travel to Brussels, where he will spend the night. And on June 14th, in Brussels, Biden will meet with NATO leaders, and he'll have a private meeting with the president of Turkey, President Erdogan. On June 15th, Biden will hold a couple more NATO meetings, and then he's going to fly to Geneva for the night, where on June 16th, he will be meeting in a first face-to-face meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The White House National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, said on Monday, according to Reuters, that it was unclear whether the 2 would hold a joint news conference after their talks. If you remember, Vladimir Putin and President Trump had their own press conference, which was interesting in its own right, but we won't be talking about that in this one, in this podcast. We'll talk about that later. But to start this breakdown of this trip, we're first going to talk about Biden's trip to the UK. So to start things off, Joe Biden issued a statement pledging to affirm his, quote, special relationship with Britain, where he will be meeting with Boris Johnson to discuss all kinds of matters. In an article for the Washington Post, Biden wrote, quote, in the United Kingdom, after meeting with Prime Minister Johnson to affirm the special relationship between our nations, I will participate in the G7 summit. Quote, this group of leading democracies and economies has not met in person in 2 years due to the coronavirus. Ending this pandemic, improving health security for all nations, and driving a robust and inclusive global economic recovery will be our top priorities. Biden also added that his time in the summit will be spent to realize America's renewed commitment to our allies and partners. Biden ran for president when he was campaigning. He ran for president on a platform of trying to rebuild relationships with European allies, whom he believed President Trump had ruined all American relationships with. It was a central part of his foreign policy agenda, and I think this G7 summit is the opportunity for President Biden to really display that he's trying to rebuild the relationship between the countries. He also added that he, quote, wanted to, quote, rally the world's democracies against some of the most significant threats of the world, which he included were the pandemic and climate change. The president is also expected to speak with Johnson about disagreements over the Brexit deal, according to Guardian, expressing his support for the Northern Ireland Protocol, which he has met fierce opposition from unionists and loyalists who say that it separates the region from the rest of the United Kingdom. That's going to be some topics of discussion, according to Reuters. After meeting with Boris Johnson, as I said, between June 11th and 13th, Biden is going to meet with the Group of Seven, or the G7's summit leaders in southwestern England, where he will hold bilateral meetings with the leaders of countries, with the countries of the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. The president participated in a virtual G7 summit earlier this year, where they discussed the COVID-19 pandemic, and they wanted to discuss other matters, of course. Now, last year's G7 summit, you might remember, was canceled. I think it was set to actually be held here in the United States, but it was canceled due to the pandemic. Now, Biden's summit with the foreign leaders will come the week after Biden is set to announce his plans to distribute millions of coronavirus vaccines worldwide. And it's a decision that came after months of discussion. This is going to be a main topic of discussion. I believe it's going to be a main topic of discussion for the G7 leaders, how to address the COVID-19 pandemic. Because the G7 countries are some of the most powerful and the richest countries in the world. So this is going to probably be a big topic of discussion, because what they do can be very influential around the world. So the things they discuss can have a huge impact, including COVID-19 vaccine distribution. Now, on June 13th, Biden will also be meeting with Queen Elizabeth at Windsor Castle, and it'll be the first time that Biden has met with the Queen in person as president. Jill Biden will then return to the United States after meeting with the Queen. We're not entirely sure what Biden is going to talk about with the Queen, but they'll probably talk about all kinds of topics between the two countries. We're not entirely sure. We'll need to wait for their meeting to see. So Biden's meeting with the G7 leaders in the UK, I think it's going to be a really important meeting for the Biden presidency, because, like I said, he ran on a platform of trying to rebuild relationships with many of these countries. And Biden's trip here is probably going to be the first affirmation of that promise, or that pledge that he made when he was running for president. We'll need to see what types of things they talk about. Earlier this year, they did have their meeting. It was they did cancel it, of course, but they did have their meeting and they did talk about stuff. But this is going to be the first in-person meeting for these countries, where they're going to be able to discuss a wide array of issues over a 3-day period, and we can have bilateral meetings with the leaders. And they've all met and talked with one another individually, but as a group, they're going to also be talking with one another and talking about the issues that the globe faces. So that's all we know about the G7 summit. That's all we know about the G7 summit, that what's going to be discussed. Now we're going to talk about part 2, which is the NATO meetings and the Vladimir Putin meeting. So after the First Lady leaves America, or leaves for America, Biden will then travel to Brussels for the NATO summit there in Belgium on June 14th, where he wants to talk about transatlantic security and collective defense. He's going to talk with NATO leaders on how to address future threats and, quote, effective burden sharing, the White House said. In that meeting, I think the thing that everybody was looking forward to is President Biden's meeting with the president of Turkey, President Erdogan, where they plan to, quote, discuss the full range of bilateral and regional issues, end quote. This is going to be an interesting meeting, because for a good part of 2019, and I'd even say the beginning of 2020, Turkey was up in a lot of news. I think after President Trump withdrew from the Middle East, there was a bit of tension between Turkey and the U.S. And over time, tensions have increased between our countries. So this meeting, I think, will be very important for for President Biden to meet with Erdogan. And It's going to be a private meeting, so we're not entirely sure of exactly what's going to be talked about. But I'm pretty sure they're going to talk about all these types of. We're probably going to find out things that they talk about, but the president, I'm pretty sure, will talk about the Middle East for sure, and President Erdogan is also going to talk about other relations with other countries in their region, and the Turco-American relationship, and where it stands. In the NATO summit, he'll continue to meet with other leaders, and he'll participate in a U.S.-European Union summit on June 15th, where the leaders there want to discuss global health security and the global economic recovery, the climate crisis, digital and trade cooperation, strengthening democracy, and addressing mutual foreign policy concerns, the White House continues to write. Biden's also going to be meeting with the Belgium royal family, with King Felipe and Belgium Prime Minister Alexander De Croo. After Biden's NATO summit, where he's going to meet with NATO leaders and talk about that stuff and meet with President Erdogan, I think the headliner thing is probably going to be Biden's meeting with the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, on June 16th. Now, not much is exactly known about what's going to be talked about with Putin, but I'm very, very sure that whatever's going to be, there's going to be a long list of things that can be talked about with Putin, because ever since Biden came in, there's been a lot of things that have happened between the U.S. and Russia. So we're going to want to take a look at the list of things that they're probably going to talk about. According to Reuters, Biden does plan on pressing Vladimir Putin on, quote, respecting human rights when they meet, and whenever they meet in their summit. President Biden will want to press Russian President Vladimir Putin to respect human rights. He said that he wants to make it clear that he will quote, not stand by and let him abuse those rights. I think he's talking about a few issues that Russia is having, but there has been a lot of not necessarily human rights issues, but there have been a few, political issues that have been going on in Russia. I think Alexei Navalny is a person that comes to mind, where he's been arrested and he's the biggest opposition leader in Russia to Putin. So he's been arrested. I think that's one thing that Biden is talking about. He also plans on talking about the cyber attacks on U.S. governmental agencies and the solar wind hack from Russia. I believe in the first episode, so the last episode, I did talk about how Russian hackers did hack into U.S. federal government services and other American private companies, the Russian government, and not necessarily Russian government, but just attacks were coming from Russia. Not sure if they were Russian government, but Biden does plan on talking with Vladimir Putin about that stuff too. It's gonna be a lot of talk. The U.S. and Russian relations are a little strained. They're denying the cyber attacks that have been going on. They've also denied election interference here in the United States, interference in our American elections. So, of course, this discussion hasn't happened, but whenever it does happen, we'll need to see what's talked about and what comes out of it. I think that's the thing we want to look for. What's going to come out of these discussions with Vladimir Putin? Of course, we haven't witnessed any of Biden's trip yet. It's only going to start tomorrow. So I can't really provide that much information or analysis, because we don't even know what's going to really be talked about, other than the textbook stuff that they've mentioned, that the White House said. Because the White House just put up the things that the White House put up are just, textbook diplomacy talk. We're going to talk about the climate crisis, and we're going to talk about economy rebuilding. We don't know what particularly is going to be talked about. So whenever that does happen, we're going to need to wait for that, and we're then going to be able to know what's talked about and what's given value and importance. I think whatever President Biden does talk about in these summits, in the UK, Belgium, and Switzerland, they're going to be really big indicators of where President Biden plans on taking this foreign policy, from things like how tough he is with our G7 allies to how tough he is with Vladimir Putin and Russia. We're going to see a wide spectrum of Biden foreign policy occurring today, in the next week or so. We're going to see all kinds of things happen. So we are going to need to keep an eye out to see what is talked about, because whatever they do talk about is going to have some sort of an impact on our lives. And it's not necessarily in a big way, but the things they talk about can really affect like with Russia, the hackings and the election interference claims, that discussions of those things can be important. And with our G7 allies, we can talk about all kinds of things. And they're going to be key partners, in my view, under a Biden presidency. With the way he's talked about embracing these allies again, I think the G7 allies are going to be big partners and big players in the global COVID-19 recovery plan. Definitely, they're all rich countries. We're all rich countries, so that's a given. But the cooperation with one another is going to probably be a big deal, and we're going to see the global vaccine distribution come from that. And that's pretty much what we have for today's episode. Thank you for joining us today. I'm so glad you did. Stay tuned for Friday's episode, where I'm thinking, I talked about this in the first episode, I'm thinking of talking about my 2024 Republican primary list. We'll see if that's in the episode. We'll need to see what happens in political news on Friday, or by Friday rather. So that's what's going to happen. That's what I plan on doing on Friday. Thank you for joining us today. Go ahead and follow us on Instagram at the Ishan S Show. And if you like this podcast, or you like the first episode and are looking forward to the third, go ahead and tell your friends and family, your neighbors, your friends, dogs, owner's cousin, or whoever. Just go tell whoever you can about this podcast and help grow this podcast, because it's only going to be through your help that we can get this across to as many people as possible. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll see you on Friday.